Review it. So welcome to the Renaissance Society Friday Community Presentation Series, also known as Talk, Talk, Talk. You may be coming to us through Renaissance or Eventbrite. We're glad you're here, regardless of where you originated from. This talk today is called Hobos and Train Hoppers, presented by Maryellen Burns. Next Friday will be Beat Poets and Artists by Lawrence Fox. So come on back. You can use the same link you used today to get into that program. Maryellen Burns is one of our presenters extraordinaire with a plethora of topics who dedicates hundreds of hours to research. So I think you're really going to enjoy today's topic. She's also been a Railroad Museum participant and supporter throughout the Northwest Pacific since 1993. We're going to get started right now with a little video and music from John Prine, just to set the mood. So here we go.
There was a time when lonely men would wander through this land, rolling aimlessly along. So many times I've heard of their sad story, written in the words of dead men's song. Down through the years, many men have yearned freedom. Some found it only on the open road. So many tears of blood have filled around us, 'cause you can't always do what you are told. Please tell, have I
And we seem to have lost the music, but we're still going to go through the slideshow just to see the photos.
Last Sunday night, I wrote a letter to my loved one. I signed my name and knew I had stayed away too long. There was a time when my heart was free to wander. And I remember as I sang this Hobo song. Please tell me where all the hobos gone. I see no fire burning down by the rusty railroad track. Could it be that I'm only left there? Tied up in life's eternal rattling sack. Tied up in life's eternal rattling sack.
Thank you so much, Kathy.
Allowing homeowners to claim $3,627. This plan was passed by the new administration led by
Right?
Biden's COVID-19 relief program includes 10.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
YouTube goes right into an ad.
Oh, so I have started my screen share. I want to thank Kathy Hart and Christy Brazil, David Haskell, and the others of you who are going to share your stories today. And all of you for joining me on what will be a really personal story about hobos and train hoppers. I've long been fascinated by both hobos, tramps, and bums, mostly from the movies I saw when I was a kid about life during the Depression, and their depiction of the really clueless rich folks' fascination with them. There are movies, I don't know if anybody ever saw Rutger Hauer and Hobo with a Shotgun, Sullivan's Travels, My Man Godfrey, Meet John Doe, and The Hobo with Oliver Hardy, just to name a handful. And later movies like Bound for Glory, the story of Woody Guthrie, Emperor of the North, Boxcar Bertha, and the singers who participated in the life that we all have grown to enjoy today: Woody Guthrie, Bob Dylan, Merle Haggard, Utah Phillips, who I was really lucky enough to meet and talk about this. I should share more of his stories. Cisco Houston, Burl Ives, and writers like Jack London and George Orwell, Carl Sandburg and Ernest Hemingway, who opened up worlds I never dreamed existed. There are other writers as well: Louis L'Amour, George Orwell. Can anyone recognize this photo of who this might be? Hard to believe that that is a very young Ernest Hemingway, but that is a very young Ernest Hemingway. So many of us now use the word hobo to refer to any homeless individual, but back in the America of the late 19th and 20th century, to be a hobo meant something more. It meant specifically to count yourself as part of a robust culture of itinerant laborers who crisscross the country by hitchhiking illegal rides on freight trains. They're still around today. David Haskell is going to share some of his stories later. Most traveled because of economic reasons: the beginning of Reconstruction, Depression in 1893, the end of World War I, race riots in Chicago, and the Great Depression in the 1930s. Hobos, and the one before, by the way, was Weary Willie. I don't know if you remember him. Emmett Kelly played him as a tramp in all of the circus things. Hobos were really unwelcome train passengers. This American institution began after the Civil War. Many former and Union and Confederate soldiers let loose their roaming spirits by traveling almost aimlessly from town to town. The figure of an unshaven man wearing tattered clothes and carrying all his possessions in a bag called the bundle became a common figure among the tracks. Along about the 1870s, such characters as Weary Willie that I talked to you about before, or Happy Hooligan, became part of the American cultural lexicon. Following in the footsteps, rail travel really allowed men and boys and the occasional woman to travel for free to follow the harvest or to find work in other seasonal occupations. A young hobo, the migrant worker of their day, might start with the day harvest in California and then go to the Rocky Mountain states for later the corn, hops, berries, and fruits in the Pacific Northwest. Winter might be in the cotton fields of Texas and the South. And spring might find a harvester drift into Southern California for the vegetables and citrus crops. The problems grew worse with the crash of the stock market in October of 1929. Many lost their jobs or saw their incomes reduced. Schools also reduced the length of the school years in many areas or closed altogether. By early 1933, over 12 million workers were unemployed, amounting to almost 25% of the US workforce. And hundreds of those thousands were children that were out of school. 3 million of those jobless were also a little bit older, 16 to 25 years of age. Seeing no hope of employment where they lived, many of all ages decided to take to the rails, jumping on freight and passenger trains without paying and riding them to various parts of the nation. Most were in search of better job opportunities elsewhere so they could send money back home, while others were looking for adventure. No longer a world of middle-class age men, the Rail Brigade now included thousands of youths and increasing numbers of women and minorities. Along the way, they met adventure, hunger, hardship, hostile security guards, and law authorities, not to mention danger, boredom, and despair, as well as many other people doing the same. Most hobos congregated near the railroad tracks, particularly at the junction of two roads. On the outskirts of camp and towns and in rural areas, camps commonly called jungles can be found in brush or trees. Garbage pile cans of glass and other debris, and sometimes the scatter of flimsy shacks mark the camp locations. What I've noticed is that my slideshow seems to be off. So I am going to, nope, I am going to go back. So my apologies. If it's all right, I'm going to try going back to where I should be in some of these photos. Or we'll just ignore them for now. So often broken mirrors would be left on hanging for the tree limbs for the use of the next transient while shaving or brushing their teeth. Hunting for wood, often twigs, to keep campfires burning during cold weather was a constant task throughout the night. When camps were unavailable or not desired, some transients would sleep under bridges or other locations. Some people would work from time to time, while others mooched free food from people as often as possible. As colorful as they were, not only did they not pay for rides, they interfered with train activities from time to time. In winter, they would start fires along the tracks, and in boxcars, the fires often went out of control and burned railroad property and freight. In some areas, the local farms, and I'll talk about it more when I talk about my father, relied on the arrested transients in local communities for field laborers. Here you'll see a picture of a chain gang working on a railroad near Asheville in 1915. Other communities would impose 30-day jail sentences or work, like you can see here on the chain gangs. Writers found better success catching trains at the edge of train yards where the trains would actually converge to the main line. In the rail yards, that rather than rail yards that were more closely patrolled, of course, the bulls or the railroad police could be hiding on trains or even disguised as a transient ready to catch the trespassers. Sometimes railroad companies, bulls, and town police were at odds over what to do with the transients. Railroad guards would be pulling transients off of trains, and town police wanted them to stay on the trains and move through to the next town. The Southern Pacific Railroad reported that its guards removed over 683 transients from trains in just 1 year. Whether a hobo, a migrant worker, preferred to work for his money, a tramp who would work when necessary but preferred the open road and freedom, and the bum, who usually had fallen so down on his luck or her luck that they had no interest in anything more than panhandling or stealing, many like now with mental health issues. The population grew increasingly multicultural, spanning the ages, and included women and young girls. Racial minorities and women were particularly vulnerable to the dangers on the rails. Young women rode the rails in far fewer numbers than young men, and often traveled disguised as males for safety reasons. Others traveled with 1 or 2 males or with a group of boys. It was estimated that in January 1933, that of the few million of transients riding the rails, only 11,000 were women, with about 30 to 40% of them under the age of 21. Before the Depression, no more than 1,000 would have been women under the age of 21. There was a survey that was conducted in 1935. It found a large proportion of African Americans, 98% who'd been unemployed for over 6 months and had to keep moving to find work. A vast majority left home because there were too many mouths to feed, and being on the road gave some respite to their families. They seldom earned enough money to send home. Clarence Lee, who was a sharecropper's son, was living in Baton Rouge. This is not him. I couldn't find a photo, but a representative. He left home in 1929 and rode the rails for 2 years until 1931. He would recall how white hobos were treated better than African Americans when it came to seeking the kindness of strangers. Quote, when you went to people's homes to ask for food, if your skin was white, you were fed better. They might let a white boy stay in the house with them, but me, I could sleep in the barn with the mules and the hay. The real inspiration for this talk, and I'll be reiterating some of the things I've said already, was really the thought of the stories that I thought my father told me. Some of the stories actually came from a friend of his, but I thought they were from him. They are fantastical, but most of them have been verified by friends of our family who also took to the road in the early 20s, long before the boxcar children of the Depression. And that was my father. After he was still riding the rails occasionally. He could dress as a dandy or as a bum, either way. And this was my father years later. So excuse me just a second. One of the people that would share stories with me was a man by the name of Irv Kozlov. He was a writer who had spent time with Hemingway in Paris. He ended up coming back to the United States, couldn't find work here, and he became a WPA writer. He documented some of the stories of the hobos and tramps during the late 1930s. And it's a lot of his recollections that I had sometimes, I think, mixed up with my father's when I'm sharing the story. Almost all of them others who rode the rails, and it included a woman by the name of Hobo Lump. She made it to 1990 and was queen of the Hobo conferences that still convene today in Brit, Art Linkletter, Louis L'Amour, Supreme Court Justice William Opal, and others that endured really incredible poverty, but left home to make a choice to be free, to reinvent themselves, to travel and experience the world. One of my father's favorites was Jack London, who we believe is a relative, but we're still trying to prove it. And this is from the road, London. I became a tramp, well, because of the life that was in me, of the wanderlust in my blood that would not let me rest. I went on the road because I couldn't keep away from it, because I hadn't the price of the railroad fare in my jeans, because I was so made that I couldn't work all my life on one same shift. And that is not a mistake. It is made and not mad. It began to look as if I should be compelled to go and to the very, Christy, could you do me a favor?
Sure.
Could you read this one for me?
Sure. It began to look as if I should be compelled to go to the very poor for my food. The very poor constitute the last sure recourse of the hungry tramp. The very poor can always be depended upon. They never turn away the hungry. Time and again, all over the United States, have I been refused food by the big house on the hill, and always have I received food from the little shack down by the creek or marsh, with its broken windows stuffed with rags and its tired-faced mother broken with labor. Oh, you charity mongers, Go to the poor and learn, for the poor alone are the charitable. They neither give nor withhold from their excess. They have no excess. They give and they withhold, never from what they need for themselves, and very often from what they cruelly need for themselves. A bone to the dog is not charity. Charity is the bone shared with the dog when you are just as hungry as the dog.
Thank you so much. So hobos and tramps are everywhere for those of you who read them in the works of Mark Twain and Jack London. Twain, if you remember, was a gentleman tramp in The Innocents Abroad and in A Tramp Abroad, and I believe in Roughing It. London always insisted that his call to writing happened before the gold rush of the Yukon, when as a hobo in 1892, he learned to tell a tale interesting and tragic enough that it would earn him a handout. His book about hoboing, The Road, 1907, I thought was nonfiction. I've since found out that it's actually a novel. His other related works taught him the delights of drifting along with the whimsicality of chance, something that my father used to quote often. He wrote lyrically about the freedom he felt beating his way across the West, and on occasion running on the deck of a night freight. Ernest Hemingway created Nick Adams, a character who populated almost 20 short stories and rode the rails across America in search of himself and the American spirit. This is going to sound like an odd place to begin, but that same spirit was emulated on July 29th, 1969. American astronauts Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to land on the moon. Earlier that day, around 5:30, just before I was leaving for work, my father had a heart attack. Instead of driving him, I waited for my mother to come get him because I did not want to miss watching the landing on the moon that was going to occur on these giant television screens during the intermission at Music Circus, where I'd been working all summer. And afterwards, I felt such guilt at abandoning him that I spent the rest of the summer by his side constantly, captivated by the many stories he told about life on the road and riding the rails as a youngster. So he revealed that, and I'm sorry, but I don't have many photos of him, so I'll just be going through different slides as we go. He revealed, and many of you heard this story from me before, that he had first run away from home 50 years earlier in 1919 at the age of 7, a decade before the Great Depression. At the time that he ran away, as I'd mentioned before, even in his period of time, 1922, more than 250,000 children from the ages of 6 to 10 were on the road, often separated from their families. These new nomads were following a well-beaten path taken by earlier generations of Americans that used to heeding Horace Greeley's admonition to go west, young man. Penniless and out of work, they left home with the belief that going westward would transform them from Mark Twain's pauper to tomorrow's millionaire. And my father was no exception. As an avid reader, he was enthralled with the stories of Jack London's The Road, the adventurer Richard Halliburton, and the life of Mark Twain tramping across America, South America, Africa, and Europe. His reading opened up a world that he wanted to embrace. He had begun to show traces of a really restless character. He would pretend to go to school, and he would instead wander off to Hobohemia, the largest enclave of hobos in America. In Chicago, almost 20,000 who would spend the winters or a slow season in camps or flop houses nearby. There were libraries, places for free or cheap coffee, greasy spoons with meals for a nickel, cheap movies, bookstores, and dozens of intellectuals who would stand on the corner spouting communist, union, or social philosophy. He was totally caught up by that world. Studs Terkel, who was born on the same day as him, June 6, 1912's father actually owned a boarding house in Hobohemia. So just to put this into perspective, Chicago became the hobo capital of America during the late 19th century as migratory workers hopped freight trains heading to and from the nation's busiest railroad hub. By the 1910s, authorities estimated that close to 500,000 transients passed through the city annually, with close to 30 to 70,000 of them present on any particular day. Comprised primarily of native-born white men, this mobile community established its Bohemian district, or its main stem, occupied a stretch of West Madison Street from the Chicago River to Halsted Street, where my father lived, to where there would be inexpensive restaurants, flop houses, and inexpensive agencies that used to cater to hobos' basic needs. A similar segregated district on South State Street between 22nd and 30th Streets accommodated Black transients. And just south of the Loop, State Street burlesque theaters provided hobos with really cheap entertainment. It truly was a city within a city. My father was especially intrigued by the bookstores on Chicago's main stem. They would collect mail, they would hold items for safekeeping, and sometimes actually hosted lodgers. The Radical Bookshop on Chicago's North Clark Street was a favorite haunt of the IWW organizers, and also a hangout for radicals of all shades of red and black. There was a hobo bookstore called the Proletariat that was also located on West Madison Street, 1 block away from the Industrial Workers of the World General Headquarters. And that would keep him fascinated for hours reading all of these newspapers. He was a voracious reader. And also the union would provide comic books for those hobos that were unable to read or barely literate. The IWW had originally formed in 1905 to organize workers excluded from the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, known as Wobblies. These unionists wanted to form one big union. Their ultimate goal was to call one big strike, which would overthrow the capitalist system. The popular literature at the time and my father's fascination with really radical politics had convinced his mother that he was a juvenile delinquent. She referred to him as a defective prone to nomadic impulses and left on his own and gripped by this really all-consuming wanderlust. He would wander off. So to protect him, she made plans for him to go to reform school. He caught on to his folks' plan and decided to catch the next train out with the assistance of an older boy as his guide. He left home with good intentions. He wrote his mother a note telling her that he was heading out to California and would try to find a way to let her know that he was safe. Unlike so many of his comrades on the road, he didn't run away from home because of circumstances that were particularly intolerable or because of the brutality of orphan homes or really the advent of reform school. His family, like so many other Jewish families from the south side of Chicago, were poor. His father, later he would discover his stepfather, was a really taciturn man who remained emotionally distant. But his mother's orthodox ways were just too limiting. He simply had a craving for the open road, a love for simple things. He wanted to see wild grown flowers, vast expanses of open sky, cool desert nights. He wanted to meet cowboy stars Tom Mix and William S. Hart and live the life he read about in the dime novels or pulp paperback novels and silent movies. So he ended up going to West Madison Avenue in Hobohemia, hoping to make his way to California. Chicago, as I said, was the greatest rail center in the US. Trains from all points of the compass would enter and leave the city over its 39 different railways. I don't think it's much different now. There were 2,840 miles of steam railways just within the city limits. He was on the road for a couple of years off and on, or so he told me. My brother Keith was told he made it out to California, only to be brought home less than a month later by the Fink Jacob Rubenstein. You might remember him as the infamous Jack Ruby, who we saw shoot Lee Harvey Oswald on television. In fact, my father recognized him and yelled out, "What is that Fink Jacob Rubenstein doing?" Just before the shot. His mother gave Jack Ruby, a quarter for every child, for Harry, and for every other child that came home, the parents would pay. She promptly called the truancy officer who placed him in reform school. And this was an occurrence that repeated itself from 8 to 10 and from 11 to 14, and I assume well into his 20s, until he met my mother at the age of 30 and curtailed his wanderlust for just a little while. Years later, he would say that it wasn't just wanderlust that impelled him to leave. From July 27 to August 1919, a race riot broke out in Chicago. When it was over, 38 people were dead, 537 were injured, and about 1,000 were rendered homeless. The incident ended up sparking the riot was the drowning of a Black youth after he drifted onto a white area of a beach on a hot 96-degree day. The reasons for the riot, however, lied not just with the young man's murder, but with segregation, vicious racism, and the organized activities of white gangs, many of which were sponsored by Chicago's political machine. Most of the rioting, the murder, and the arson were concentrated in the Black Belt, far from where my father lived, but the complicity of some of his neighbors was too much for him, and he started to fear also for his own safety as a Jew. He talked to me often about his stories. He said, "My first ride, I was both excited by the adventure and terrified of the dangers. A friend who was well versed in how and where to catch a train taught me that trying to catch a train was dangerous. Better to sneak in while a train was switching back or being loaded. My first time, I literally just crouched behind some bushes, waiting until the brakeman had checked it for hobos and was busy searching others. I quickly closed the door and crouched in the corner, covering myself up with hay. When I finally opened up my eyes, we were on the open road." This is a picture of some of the times he would actually do this risky business. He couldn't get into a car, and this was actually riding the rods. He described that there were two other young boys in the doorway who would dangle their feet out of the boxcar. One man was staring out at the rolling countryside. One sat against the wall next to the door. One man paced back and forth across the length of the car. And the last occupant was in the corner with his pants around his ankles, trying to relieve himself. The train went for hours, and the clickety-clack of the wheels lulled him to sleep. In those days, trains only traveled around 600 miles in 24 hours, so it would take almost a week to get to California. I still think he went south. We'll tell more that story in a little bit. After less than 12 hours, however, he ended up waking up in a southern town where railroad bulls were waiting at the station to rouse the hobos and put them into work camps. He was observant, he was fast, and he was able to outrun them, this time at least. His friend wasn't so lucky, and quickly he was on his own. He quickly attached himself to some older boys who also got away and taught him how to help himself to free lunch counters. After dark, he would crawl under the bushes in public parks with homeless people and soon acquired the argot of the toughs to warn off predators. He continued that language, by the way, for the rest of his life. If anybody in this crowd met him and you know who Damon Runyon is, that's kind of how he would write and talk. He became a writer later. It was in a town called Tangipahoa, Louisiana, I'm pronouncing that wrong, where he remembered stealing bread at houses left by the bakers in the early morning and cleaning out the milk and the cream jugs. For lodging, he would often sleep under the tarpaulins that covered the cotton. Soon the days just blended together. He woke up hungry, worried about where he might find something to eat. After breakfast, he worried about where to go. Afternoon, worried about more food. When it got dark, worried about where he was going to sleep. Figured out soon enough that he couldn't survive on the road day to day. So he had to figure out a way where he could stay for a week to 10 days. And during his many years on the road, and he was on the road literally from 1919, I think, till sometime in the late 30s or even 40s later, he went back to the South to work with sharecroppers to help unionize both the seamstresses and the sharecroppers themselves. He credited his survival literally on the beneficence of the Black sharecroppers who had next to nothing, but were willing to share it with a young man who he offered to write letters for them and deliver them to their families in the North when he would come home. He was a voracious writer. There's a story of one of the times when he was on a chain gang where all he had was toilet paper, wrote 25,000 different words on it without repeating a word. And that's a story that's been verified by quite a few other people who knew him. He soon discovered the secret hobo symbol for a generous Jewish family or widow, most of whom kept their religion secret from their neighbors, again, because of the wide anti-Semitism. He made sure to never undress in front of anyone, so they would not know that he was circumcised. But he would also would use a few words in Yiddish, oftentimes with the family, resulting in finding a really simple meal and a place to exchange for a few hours of work each day. And it wasn't always easy. On what seemed like my 10th attempt of knocking on doors one day and being turned away, a woman came to the door late at night. Came to the door late at night with a child on her hip. I was shamefully aware of the dirt and dust on my shoes and on my clothes. I wanted to run, but my hunger was stronger than my shame. So I took the simple sandwich she offered me. She didn't have an extra blanket, but told me that I could sleep outside. The next morning, she told me that if I could go up to houses where I was clean and offered to do a little work, I had a much better chance of getting someone to actually take me in, as no one wanted to see a dirty, unkempt kid on their doorstep. She gave me a set of clean clothes, although they were pretty tattered. Her oldest son had outgrown, and she set a bath for him in a galvanized tub outside so he could get clean. When I was done, he continued, she invited me for breakfast, a meager serving of biscuit with just a tinge of gravy. When I was done, she gave me instructions for how I was to approach the next house and handed me a bindle with the clean clothes and a little cloth bag with the sandwich and a piece of fruit. She said, always look to make sure that a woman is outside hanging laundry or doing a chore, she advised. It is more reliable than you're being turned down at the door. Go to her, tip your hat. My father always wore a little cap, and smile and tell you like something to eat in exchange for some work, if she was to be so kind. Ask for something simple like an apple or orange. Wouldn't have been an orange. It wouldn't have been easy to find, or a sandwich, something that you can take on the road with you so that they didn't think that you were going to stay for a long time. Offer to mow her lawn, change a tire on a car, or paint a fence. When she was done, she gave me a hug and then pressed 2 bits into my palm. I remembered thinking, boy, this is going to be a great life. And I didn't even have to do any work this time. It was, and it wasn't. My father was not adverse to begging, though. He felt no shame. He knew that he could always get enough to buy a cheese or egg sandwich and a pint of milk for a nickel. Nights he'd say, I'd get homesick waiting for a train with nobody to talk to, sitting alone on a pile of ties under a water tank in the middle of nowhere. You're only a kid and you get to dreaming about that warm bed back home and my mother's matzo ball soup, going to Maxwell Street with Pa and my old neighborhood. I wrote letters to her that I never sent, wrote on whatever was handy, scraps of paper, backs of catalogs, and even old fabric, still traveling around the country, hitchhiking, bumming rides, working occasionally. He would often just allow himself to get caught, knowing that that allowed him to spend 30 to 60 days in a work camp where he would get plenty of food. He would be sent home. Oftentimes, he'd end up in reform school and then sneak out again, always dreaming of a new life, romantic and adventuresome. He saw himself not as a bum or a tramp, but as a vagabond. That was something that I think could be said of him for his entire life. If he could just stay away from the bulls and keep moving and not be caught, he was really happy. Getting in and out of town often brought a run-in with both the railroad police and the local officers. Remember, it was a railroad bull's duty to eject trespassers from the railroad property, which would send them down Main Street, where the town cops were equally unwilling to welcome them. The general rule of thumb was for the police to visit the jungles and shelters each morning and escort to the city limits those who showed a propensity for wanting to stay more than one day, like my dad. So he always figured out an escape route or jumped off the train early before it pulled into its destination. To be homeless and without visible means of support was considered a crime called vagrancy, which was really vigorously prosecuted in the early 20th century. Hobos who were vagrants were often convicted without a jury hearing and could be forced to work without pay on a farm for 30 days or more. In 1972, the US Supreme Court ruled that a Florida vagrancy statute was unconstitutional because it was too vague and undefined. And since then, arrests for vagrancy can only be made if they were tied to observable acts such as panhandling. He would occasionally stop at a mission for a handout, but soon learned that most of them were what he called out and out racketeers, using God and the Bible as a front for soliciting funds and clothes. He became an atheist, which further alienated him from his mother. He would spare none of the details. After 6 months on the road, it lost its luster and freshness each day. And each day really became a quest for bread or for warmth. The worst fear was getting shot by a farmer who didn't want you to want you on his land. If dark hit and you were on his property, he had the right to shoot you in almost every state that he was in. If you got to the place before dark, they might let you sleep in the barn or tell you to just keep on going. He told me, I did things that shame me now, things that I never want you kids to experience. I was alone and hungry, my clothes ragged and torn. Bread lines often denied me food, and I'd eat half-cooked, indigestible slop as food, secondhand clothes received in return for hours and days at the woodpile or in the kitchen. He quickly realized that riding the rails could be dangerous, so he resorted to something a ride for cars for a while to go short distances. It was impossible to hitchhike at night, which meant that you had to find a flop house to sleep in or in the open. He soon realized that you could ride all night on the train and be a lot further down the road. He could also be among other young people or teens who would help guide and protect him. Mostly, he said, you hitchhike alone and took your chances with the people who picked you up. On the railroads, you were part of a small army. I would look for a hobo jungle and look for someone smart and upbeat out for an adventure. Most hobos were stoic, solitary individuals who had given up on life itself. Freezing and making a small fire with scraps of wood and paper on the boxcar floor was almost all some of them could handle. Famished and often lonely, he soon discovered that a younger boy could become an easy prey of an older man. They were often referred to as Airedales or jockers. The boy who was away from home without money and who didn't have the courage to beg was the easiest to win over. The older man obtained clothes and food for the boy, later teaching the boy how to get both for himself. And far from being miserable, the boy did not want to be separated from his friend. he often refused all efforts at his rescue, as it was the only way that he could survive. These the Yeggs were master tramps of criminal bent, schooled in what he referred to as Fagin's ways, like the lads in Oliver Twist. He was approached many times by older men, but he would seek out an experienced older teen or a homeless woman to avoid the transgressors. And he talked about every trainload had a wolf waiting to seduce boys. At the time that he shared this story, and I will tell you that I also got sick soon after with mononucleosis. So there was about a 3-month period when it was my dad and I almost every day. And he would tell these stories. He gave me a journal to write most of these in and a calendar, but his story was so vivid that it's not hard for me to remember them. I was enamored anyway by Burl Ives. He was the actor and also a folk musician. And some of you might remember that he owned a kind of an honky tonk called, if I remember, Lloyd's of Linden in the small town of Linden right outside of Lodi. I would listen constantly to Ives' rendition of the Red Rock Candy Mountain incessantly. I'm sure that many of you know that story as well. But my father taught me the verse he learned while on the road and sung by the infamous Harry McClintock. And again, I'm going to ask Christy if she would give us the translation here.
Okay, Big Rock Candy Mountain. The punk rolled up his big blue eyes and said to the jocker, Sandy, I've biked and, excuse me, it must be hiked and wandered too, but I ain't seen any candy. I've hiked and hiked till my feet are sore, and I'll be damned if I hike anymore. To be buggered sore like a hobo's whore in the Big Rock Candy Mountains. Harry McClintock.
Yes, and that is a version that I had not heard, but my father actually saw that he was upset that it was such a popular song because during the time that he was on the road, it was a way of warning kids about pedophiles. So years later, I was sharing this story with our friend Indira Smith. She had also traveled the trains during the same time. She told the story of once falling asleep in a boxcar wrapped around her husband-to-be. Suddenly she woke up and discovered that another man had spooned her, being polite, and was reaching under her dress. She gave him a really hard shove and a punch in his privates. She then made sure that Gavin, her intended, was between them and decided that even though she knew she could be arrested for impersonating a man, it was illegal to do that, she would dress in men's clothing from then on while on the trains. In the morning, Gavin told her that he thought she was being abnormally provocative during the middle of the night, fondling his family jewels. He was aroused and turned to embrace her when he realized it was indeed their male traveling companion. The companion was now no longer on the train, and the boxcar door was slightly ajar. At the height, and this is a current person who is today, but at the height of the Great Depression, again, 250,000 teenage hobos were roaming America. What's not in those figures is the younger kids like my dad, but by now he was among the teenagers. Some left home because they felt like they were really a burden to their families. Some fled home shattered by the shame of unemployment and poverty. Some left because it just seemed like a great adventure. With the blessing of parents or as runaways, they hit the road and wandered in search of a better life. Boy or girl's decision to leave home was often intensely personal, often spurred by naivete and hope. Many held grand visions of finding work and sending money home. Like their parents, many sought jobs that simply did not exist. And you have to remember, we did not have child labor laws then. There's a couple of people who are in this room that worked at the age of 12 as migrant workers in California, and know that that is still true today. There were people who saw the American spirit really embodied in these young wanderers. There were others who feared them as the vanguard of an American rebel, potentially as dangerous as the young fascists then on the march in Germany and Italy. At the time that we were having our own depression, there were these groups of young thugs and fascists using the trains in Germany to literally scare people. Living such a lifestyle on the margins of society really demanded the mastery of certain techniques, as well as a body of secret knowledge symbolized in the Hobo Code, which was a special hieroglyphic language. The more, and this is one that is Hobo signs from California in 1870. We had a large Black migrant population that would travel throughout the Central and Sacramento Valley and down into LA looking for work, and again would use these symbols to know where safe places to go. Wandering from place to place and performing odd jobs in exchange for food and money, hobos were often met with both open arms and firearms, writes Antique Archaeology magazine's Sarah Buchholz. From illegally jumping trains to stealing scraps from a farmer's market, the hobo community needed to create a secret language to warn and welcome fellow hobos that were either new to town or just passing through. And I don't know if you guys can see me, but I am wearing hobo signs and symbols that I got up in a rail yard in Jamestown. These are just a few of the symbols that were used. As I said, some academics are saying it was used less often as possible. And I think Dave Haskell can talk about it's kind of switched to now graffiti on trains instead of these hieroglyphics. It might really, so one of the things is many of the transients would carry a piece of chalk with them in their pocket. And through this use of common symbols, they would mark locations where food could be found, safe campsites, dangerous dogs, dangerous towns, and clean drinking water. This really brilliant hieroglyphic-like language appeared random enough for busy people to ignore, but was perfectly distinctive for hobos to translate. The code assigned circles and arrows for general directions like where to find a meal or best place to camp, and hashtags signal danger ahead like bad water or an inhospitable town. And this one is from the 1930s. It wasn't until the 1950s economic revival that the road really became less traveled. The number of traveling workers fell dramatically by the 1950s as Jack Kerouac, who I think Larry's going to talk about next week, and was no stranger to hobo life, as we know from his book, the Lonesome Traveler in 1960, but really the On the Road as well. The American hobo had a hard time hoboing due to the increase in police surveillance of the highways, railroad yards, seashores, river bottoms, embankments, and the thousands and one hidey holes of the industrial night. What happened instead is most people started hitchhiking. I'm sure all of you did during the 60s. We have one Renaissance member who hitchhiked her way through Europe. There are now hobo conventions that are still held in Britt, and I believe it's Britt, Utah. It remains strong today. They crown a hobo king and queen every year. There is still also a small and kind of present population of youth known as dirty kids. This is some of them who travel around the country in cars or hopping trains and subsist off of what they can find. Unlike hobos, there is not a huge emphasis on finding work, but many of them find the same spiritual aspect in travel that many hobos say is the reason they stayed on the road. To discover more, I'm going to suggest that you read the works of Sacramento Dale Maharaj. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He's not a Sacramento now, but he wrote a book based on James Agee's Let's Praise Human, Let Us Praise, I'm going to forget the title, based on Agee's book. Also, William, this is a book that I used, Eddie Joe Cotton, A Young Man's Thoughts on Trains and Tramping in America. This is William Vollman, who's also from Sacramento. He is considered one of the 10 best American writers today. He's been nominated, by the way, for Nobel Awards in literature, and he still is hopping trains today and has written extensively on the homeless issues in Sacramento. And the brilliant Ted Conover, who indicates that young millennials are just not finding the aspect as romantic, thrilling, or as compelling as previous generations. This is William Vollman's book, Writing Toward Everywhere. I really recommend that you read it. I want to open this up to other people to talk. We have Dave Haskell. I'm sure we have questions, that is going to read one of his poems. And I want to just thank so much Kathy Hart, Christy Brazil, and Bonnie Penix, who developed this series. Throwing it over to you, Christy.
Okay, if you have any desire to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand, literally turning on your video, and we'll try to recognize you, or use the reactions button at the bottom and you can raise your hand digitally. That kind of helps us see in your little box that you've got a question. Or if you have a story perhaps about your time on the rails or a family member's, we'd love to hear any of those. So please, let's open it up to whoever might want to share something. Linda's iPad. Go ahead, you're unmuted. Share with us what you've got.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I grew up in the Feather River Canyon, and I was 10 years old when we moved up there. And my dad would work with PG&E, and so we lived close to a powerhouse, and right across the river was where the train track was. So, you know, that was back in the days when the California Zephyr did a lot of things. And it just was interesting because on one occasion, my mother had told me when I came home from school that a hobo came to the door for food, and ended up, she gave him, she said, you wait outside and I'll make you a sandwich. And she made him a sandwich and then gave it to him. And I would, you know, I was so pleased that she did that. I mean, and especially hearing this now, you know, women never knew, and she was home by herself when that happened, you know, but it did. My family was like that, you know. But when you talked about having this series, I was excited because I would see, as a kid, I would see the hobos riding on the trains across. Sometimes, you know, as kids, we'd wave, you know, and they'd wave. And then my mother, when she saw us wave, said, now don't be waving because they'll think you're friendly and they'll come over here. That's all I had to say. I really enjoyed this. I mean, it is another world. So thanks again.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you so much. Lynette, you're next up.
Hi.
There you go.
Hi. Thank you. This was really interesting. I appreciate your talk, Maryellen. I just wanted to say that my father also rode the rails. Sounds like it was later than your dad. He did that. My dad did it in the late 1930s. And his reason for leaving the family farm in South Dakota was because he didn't get along with his stepfather. So he decided he was just going to take off at the age of 16. And so he rode the rails for a couple of years. And one of his stories that he told that I thought was particularly amusing is that it was just before the United States had officially entered World War II. My dad wanted to go over to Europe and fight. So he rode the rails up to the Canadian border, snuck in, gave a false name, and he looked all of, you know, probably 14. He was a very rosy-cheeked farm boy, and the border patrol knew immediately that he was lying, but they were nice to him, and they let him stay there in their barracks overnight and fed him, and then they just sent him back across the border and told him in no uncertain terms that he needed to contact his mother and head on home, little, you know, kid. And So anyway, I just thought that was pretty funny that he tried to join. He wanted to join the Canadian Air Force. So anyway, I thought that was pretty funny. In addition to many of the things that you had shared, he shared some of those images as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that story. The best part of this for me is hearing other people's stories. So, and thank you, Christy, for moderating.
You bet. We had also at this time, before we could go to Lawrence Fox next, invite anybody to turn on your video just so we have a little bit more sense of community here, because we like to see faces so much more than names. Please join in the fun. Lawrence, you got something?
Yes, a couple of things. When I was had a trip through Europe, I had just had spent 2 months in Europe, and I was very low in cash. I took a plane from Sacramento to England, and by the time I got there, the airline was no longer in business. So it was pretty sketchy, but I hitchhiked around as much as I could. And I actually hitchhiked straight from Brindisi all the way up the coast of Italy to the Austrian border. So I spent all my time traveling around Italy by hitchhiking, except when I was in towns. But what I also did was I've been involved with the I Street Press from the beginning of it. And the first book I did, I've done about 30 books for people. In fact, right now I'm working on a book for Ray Tatter. But the first book I worked on was by a man called Mark Bell. And he was not a hobo, but he was a homeless man. And he lived on the side of the river in a tent with his cat. Anyway, Mark wrote the book called Hobo Speaks, and he decided to write the book as not himself, but as a hobo, that he could have poetry and sort of talk about the different things that he knew. But well, he was in the newspaper. In fact, if you look up his name, you should be able to find something about Mark Bell. But he thought that when he wrote this book that he would become rich and famous. And what happened is he was able to get a laptop when people first started talking about him working on this book. And so I helped him for free, but he became so angry when he realized he wasn't going to be making any money immediately that he would go to the library, and he was so irritating that they finally permanently banned him from being in the library. And since then he's now dead. I don't know how he died, but anyway, he had an interesting
I
life.
said that so abruptly. Carlos Alcala has a beautiful story. In fact, stories about Larry's involvement, my involvement, Rick Castro's Rivka Sass, and the story of Mark. So you might want to check that one out. Thank you, Larry, for sharing that story.
Okay, thank you.
I meant to include it and forgot to.
Robin, you're up next. What to share? I'll ask you to unmute here. Maybe you're having trouble.
And then a reminder that Dave Haskell. So after Robin, then Dale, then Dave Haskell.
Okay, very good. Robin, go ahead.
It didn't work. I want to show you my.
Now try it, Robin.
Oh, she just muted again.
Unmute yourself and do your phone now.
Okay, start my video.
Muted, Robin.
There I am.
There you go.
Okay. My great-grandfather was a druggist in Puyallup, Washington, and he would trade for unusual things with just about anybody. And he ended up with 2 tramp art baskets. And this one is made out of 2 tin cans. Can you see it?
A little bit. Oh, yes.
Yes.
Oh, lovely.
There's, and what they did is they cut it first this way, the first can, and then the other can, they cut the strips and then just set them down into it. There's no glue, there's no pins. It's all folded so that it all comes together.
It is ingenious.
And he would trade patent medicines for this. If somebody needed aspirins or something like that, that's what he would trade.
Wonderful.
Yes, and my great grandmother liked that better than anything else. I know that there were a few cigar box frames and other things like that, but no, she liked the baskets. So she was able to take them home.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. That's special
Mhm.
indeed. So why don't we take a little break here and go to David Haskell, who has a poem for us. Is that right, David? You wanna unmute yourself and start your.
I,
Are you there?
yeah. Oh, hi, real quick. I sent a note to Maryellen, but I think she hasn't seen it. But what was your family name?
Oh, Harry Burns, same last name, but
Oh.
don't get me started on real names because when my father was traveling, he was traveling under Harry Bernstein. That's probably where most of his FBI records are. But that wasn't his real name either, so.
But Burns.
Burns, B-U-R-N-S. And there's others from, I might mention that there's a whole group of people here from Chicago. We need to do a Chicago.
I know. Well, my dad's family, I was born there. We left when I was 7.5. But okay, just wanted to know what the name was. Thank
Yeah,
you.
Harry Burns, but also Harry Bernstein or Herschel Smadden.
Herschel Snadden.
Smadden, S-M-A-D-E-N. And I'm sure he had a lot of aliases, I have to tell you. The one thing I forgot to
Interesting.
ask was his moniker, because, most hobos had, as Dave will probably tell you, had monikers. Were we able to get Dave back in?
Doesn't look like it. Maybe he's gone to find his poems or something.
Hold on, let me ask to start vote. Let me do that. I've asked him to unmute and.
Okay.
Oh,
There we
there-
go.
Unmute.
And can you start your video, David?
I suddenly lost.
Can you hear me
Yes.
now? I tried to unmute.
Can hear you and we can see you. So do share with us. Tell us maybe a little background about.
Oh, can you see me too?
Yes, we can
Yes.
see you and hear you, David.
And you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I would get a little presentation. Here's a picture of me back in the 70s when I was hoboing. Well, not actually, the vagabond, dressed kind of in a mixture of disco and Western shirt, getting ready to start riding trains from Connecticut back to California. That was the goal. So I had my sleeping bag and my rope around my shoulder and all my clothes and stuff in the sleeping bag. At least that's how I kind of did it. So this is from 1975. So this poem I'm going to read is called Boxcar Autographs. And this is back in the 60s and 70s when I worked on the railroad and also was riding trains. The hobos, I call them Latter-day hobos, would write their names on the side of the boxcars, usually using car knocker chalk. Now, car knocker chalk is a big block of chalk, almost the size of your, at least your thumb. And the car knocker would walk up and down the tracks and he would mark the cars, check them, and put things like bad order, broken spring, bad order, door off hinge. So he would knock on the cars and get the train ready to leave the yard. And he would write notes on the sides of the cars. And I think near as I could tell that the hobos, they would find this car knocker chalk and they would put their names and things on the side of the boxcars. And so this poem is about ones I saw a lot. Waterbed Lou, Charlie Brown, Bozo Texino, and Herbie. So this is the poem called Boxcar Autographs. I see your names rolling by on the boxcar walls. Time has faded your autographs into yellow chalk and scrawls. Your signatures help me imagine I was one of the few to ride the rails and become a famous hobo like you. Waterbed Lou, what happened to you? You had a good job working on the rails until you woke up in too many jails. And now you write your name all over every SP trade. and good old Charlie Brown. You sure have been around. You always ride the WP because we told you it was free. Stupid. I know real names are seldom exchanged, so there's nothing that needs to be explained. But a free cigarette makes a friend until the next yard switches you out again. Hey there, bozo tuxedo, wearing your Texas tuxedo, stogie hanging from a gambler's grin. How do you pick the right train? It's a sin. And Herbie, it's good to know that you're still alive. I've seen your sign since at least 1969. Searching for that hobo's dream where you could be, that free man sleeping under a palm tree. You all followed every pumpkin wine, ridden every one train a day line, slept beside the rat tail spurs, waiting for a steel-wheeled chauffeur. You watch the faces of the riders change, but the ride is still the same. So that's boxcar autographs. And any questions about riding trains or things, or?
What a treat, Dave.
Dave, that was fantastic. I've got
Did you hear that?
but let's go to Judy Zimmerman first. Then I'll tell the story and then I've got some questions myself.
Judy?
Yes,
Okay.
because I just got my father's autobiography off the shelf about half an hour
Oh, good.
before the class began. I'm wondering if the hobo portion I might share a little bit next week, if we'll have the opportunity, because I need to review it. I haven't read it for a while. So would there be an opportunity
Yeah,
next week?
it won't be on the, was he a beat poet? It might not fit next week, but I'd love to make sure that we continue this. So we'll come up with the mechanism because I'm sure there are other people that have stories.
Okay, I'll wait then.
Yeah, that's
Instead
wonderful.
of sharing now, I'll wait.
Okay, great, good. And I wanted to, Larry, did you have your hand back up again?
Yes.
Okay, and then I'm going to tell a story, but you go first.
Okay. Well, since I'm here, there's on the road, which is backwards, but it's Jack Kerouac on the road. Anyway, that will be talking a little bit about that on the 8th. But I have a friend who, when they were small, they had an uncle who was a hobo, and the uncle lived in Seattle and would come down to the Bay Area to visit his family. And one time they were there, they had come on a trip, and to come back from the trip, they were getting out of the car, and they heard all these noise under the house, and they found out that the uncle was sleeping under the house in the crawl space, 18 inches of crawl space. So that was one of the ways that they were able to take care of being safe while they were traveling around hiding. So anyway, I thought that was kind of an interesting thing.
Oh, good. Thank you. So I have a couple of questions for Dave. Then what we're going to do, I wanted to tell a story. Then we're going to stop the recording. And I like going to what I call the green room. There's some of you that are too shy. You don't want to be recorded, so we'll do that. But one of the stories that I wanted to share, and this was one of those topics where I realized I could truly do 6 weeks on it. There are so many stories that we could share, each one of the individual writers. But I was involved in a project at a place called Ardenwood Historic Farm. Larry was involved in a different project there. I think he might have been on this excursion. We did a project called This Old Flat Car, where we built a flat car in real time at Rail Fair. But one of the things that they had was a rail car that was driven by a horse. If I remember, the horse was Slick. And kids would come on. This is a 270-acre farm. If you've never been there, you have to go to Ardenwood Historic Farmhouse, 270 acres of gardens that kids can do. And we did lots of theater type productions. But one was where the kids got on the train. We threw off a shoe from the horse and pretended that we had to stop the train for a couple of hours while the horse got shoed. The kids went into a back area where we had actors, mostly from ACT. They were professional actors. that were at a hobo camp from the 1930s. The kids had to literally pull their own vegetables. We taught them how to do Slumgullion, and each one of the actors told a different story of being on the road. And we even had kid actors that were the age of 12 that showed that story. We also had Gandy dancers that we did both at the California Railroad Museum, where we would have kids get to build rail in real time using the traditional methods of the Black Gandy dancers and the Chinese who worked on the railroads. They're still operational. It's my understanding that they're still doing some of that, so I encourage you to go. So that's my other story. Dave, I have a question for you. So I didn't talk about it because I didn't want to go into a lot of detail. One of the things that I did was I told the story of my father just waited for a train, but that's not really true. He oftentimes very safely ran to catch trains, when he could, when they slowed down. Could you explain some safe ways and also the dangers of getting off and on a train? You need to unmute yourself. David, you need to unmute yourself. You need to do it, not me.
Is that unmuted?
Yes.
Okay. When I do a reading, I kind of explain to people, say, somebody, you don't jump a freight train or jump or hop a freight train. You grab a hold of a freight train. Someone who jumps or hops a freight train means you've left the ground and you're grabbing a hold of this moving car. This is on a moving train. And people that do that are the ones that get hurt and sometimes killed. So you grab a hold of a freight train as it's going by, and then you pull yourself up, climb up the ladder, whatever way like that. As a switchman, my job was to get off and on moving freight cars. So I kind of had the technique down working as a switchman on the railroad, but there were times if things go wrong on the railroad, you're usually going to have a bad accident, a very bad accident. So you want to get on a train that's sitting there. But like one time I was catching trains in Memphis, Tennessee, and I had my little railroad atlas. There were 4 different railroads going down that track. And I was trying to go to, so you had to pick which train to get on, or you could go in some crazy other place you had no intention. And that was part of the problem riding freight trains, is getting on the right one. That's why Bozo Lucky Texino, he could always pick the right train. I mean, that's my story about the guy. Anyway, but yeah, it's a little bit about riding train. It's dangerous. You don't want to ride a moving train, but if you've got bulls in the yard working, a lot of times you have to catch the train as it's leaving the yard. And they have a speed limit of about 4 or 5 miles an hour. But once those engines get outside the yard limit, then they take off. So the other problem is, especially in modern times, is finding an open car. And a lot of the box cars are sealed. So a lot of times you don't have many choices. My worst choice was an open gondola car once in Yermo, Southern California in the desert. The only open car, I got in it in the middle of the night. It's full of slag from the steel mills in Utah. And I rode in these huge chunks of slag, 200 or 300 pounds each. And I spent my whole load perched like this because it was the only car I could get into. So you got to pick your car. If the train's moving, and you have to make a bad choice, because that may be the only choice you're going to get. That rest of the train leaves, now you're stuck there for another 4, 5, 10 hours. So find the right car. And what I call a Hobos hotel is an old wooden box car, which you don't see any of anymore. But back in the 60s, there were still a few left. All wooden box car, warmer in the winter, cooler in the summer, quieter to ride in. It was a hobo motel. Anyway, that's my story.
Great. David, thank you so much. I'm going to just ask if there's any more questions, and if not, what we'll do is we'll stop recording. Christy will do some closing remarks, and then we'll stay in the green room so that you shy people can still talk. So Christy, you want to wrap it up for me?
Thank you very much, Maryellen. I was just thinking with that last story, Renaissance, we're a full service society where you can learn how to become a hobo if you need to. What fun for learning, connecting, and sharing we are. I want to thank everybody for attending today. Remind you too, this afternoon talk is the Friday Forum. It's Dr. Mary Lee Vance doing the disabled rights movement, are sharing with us that kind of information, which could be invaluable as well too. Hope you come back and attend that. And again, be here again next Friday for Lawrence Fox talking about beat poets and artists. And we're going to stop recording now. So if in fact you'd like to speak without the recording on, we'd like to just hang around and share whatever stories you might have. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.